The wind in Silver Ridge didn't just blow, it scoured. On April 18, 1881, it whipped across the fresh earth of the cemetery, stinging Clara Miller's eyes as she stood over the grave of her husband, Jack. He had been 29, a man who worked harder than the mules in the Silver Star mine, only to be crushed by a timber support that gave way 200 feet underground. The funeral was a stark, dusty affair. 5 coffins for 5 men, with 5 widows standing in black. A mining company representative, looking uncomfortable in a clean suit, had pressed $10 into Clara's hand earlier that morning. He called it a gesture of goodwill, carefully reciting a legal script that the timber failure was an act of God, not company negligence. $10. Enough to bury a husband, but barely enough to keep the living from starving. Clara tightened her grip on the small, trembling hand of her 6-year-old son, Leo. She was 26 years old, alone in a territory that had no use for a woman without a man, and possessed exactly $3 to her name after the funeral expenses. "Mama?" Leo's voice was small, swallowed by the wind. "Are we going to the house now?" Clara looked down at him. He was shivering, not just from the grief, but from the biting New Mexico chill. She couldn't tell him they didn't have a house. They had a hole. "Yes, Leo," she said, her voice steady. "We're going home." They walked past the boarding houses and saloons of Silver Ridge, where rents had skyrocketed to $5 a month. Prices that had forced Jack to claim a cave outside of town 2 years ago because they couldn't afford civilized living. The locals sneered as she passed, whispering about Miller's hole with derision. To them, living in a cave was the ultimate admission of failure in a town obsessed with silver and status. When they reached the limestone hillside a mile out of town, the reality hit her with brutal clarity. The cave was dark and socially embarrassing, though Jack had tried his best, building a wooden front wall with a door and 2 windows. Inside, the air was damp. Clara knelt to light the small stove Jack had installed near the entrance. It was a poor system. The stovepipe exited horizontally through the wooden wall, fighting the natural air pressure. As the kindling caught, acrid smoke didn't rise. It pooled, filling the small space. Leo started to cough, a harsh hacking sound that rattled in his small chest. Clara watched the smoke swirl around her son. The mining company expected her to vanish. The town expected her to beg or take up domestic service for mere room and board. But looking at Leo, rubbing his smoke-stung eyes, a cold, steel-like resolve hardened in Clara's chest. She wouldn't let this cave be their tomb. She had her father's engineering books in her head, and she had a son to keep alive. "Go outside, Leo," she said softly, kicking the stove door shut. "Mama's going to fix this, for good." That night, the cave was less a home and more a suffocating box. The air inside was heavy and stale, clinging to the damp limestone walls. While Leo slept fitfully, wrapped in their only 2 heavy blankets, Clara sat awake, staring at the useless stove Jack had installed. The smoke lingered low, refusing to leave through the horizontal pipe that fought against the natural pressure of the earth. Clara closed her eyes and thought of her father. He had been a mining engineer in California, a man who spoke the language of rock and air. He had taught her that the earth wasn't just dead weight, it was a system. He had explained that below a certain depth, the earth maintains a constant temperature, in this latitude, exactly 52 degrees. She placed her hand against the cold limestone wall. It wasn't freezing, it was stable. Jack had seen a cheap shelter, but Clara suddenly saw a thermal battery. If she could just get the air to move, the stone would hold the heat, not lose it like the thin wooden walls of the shacks in town. By dawn, she had a plan sketched on the back of a mining circular. It was audacious, a vertical chimney shaft drilled straight up through the ceiling, penetrating 20 feet of solid limestone to the surface. It would create a natural draft, pulling the smoke up and drawing fresh air in. Clara washed the soot from her face, straightened her widow's weeds, and marched into town to see Mr. Henderson. Henderson was Silver Ridge's premier builder and mason, a man who built square houses for square lives. He looked at her drawing, then at her, and let out a laugh that was short and dry as dust. "Mrs. Miller," Henderson said, wiping his hands on a rag. You want to drill a chimney through 20 feet of solid rock? By hand? It's limestone, Mr. Henderson. It's softer than granite, Clara replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The vertical draft will solve the ventilation. The thermal mass will handle the heating. Henderson tossed the paper back onto his desk. This isn't engineering, Clara. It's a pipe dream. Even if it were possible, it's not a job for a woman. And certainly not for a widow with $3 to her name. He leaned forward, his tone shifting from dismissive to menacingly paternal. People are talking. Living in a cave is one thing for a prospector. But you have a boy. A child shouldn't be living like a badger in a hole. The threat hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. If you don't act like a civilized woman, the town will take your son. My son needs a warm home, Clara said coldly, and I intend to give him one. Then get a job at the saloon and rent a room like a normal person, Henderson snapped. I won't help you bury yourself and that boy under a mountain. Clara walked out, her cheeks burning. Rejection stung, but Henderson's threat about Leo had ignited a different kind of fire in her gut. She walked straight past the bakery and into the hardware store. She placed $2.50 on the counter, nearly everything she had left in the world. I need a 4-pound hammer and a cold chisel, she told the clerk. The clerk blinked, looking at the petite woman in the black dress. Planning on some remodeling, Mrs. Miller? Something like that. She walked back to the cave with the heavy tools wrapped in burlap. The weight of the steel pulled at her shoulder, but it felt grounding. Henderson was right about one thing. Nobody was going to help her. When she stepped back into the dim twilight of the cave, Leo was sitting up, rubbing his eyes. Did the man say he would fix the smoke, Mama? Clara looked at the ceiling, at the spot in the back third of the cave where the rock was thickest. She unwrapped the hammer. The steel was cold, promising brutal work, but also promising survival. No, Leo, Clara said, gripping the handle until her knuckles turned white. We're going to fix it ourselves. The romance of the idea died within the first hour. The reality of drilling through limestone was a brutal, vibrating shock that traveled down the steel chisel, through the wooden handle of the hammer, and exploded into Clara's shoulders. The technique was simple, primitive, and punishing. Clara had to stand on a makeshift crate, pressing the cold chisel against the ceiling, angled slightly upward to ensure the chimney would exit vertically above ground. She would strike it with a full-force overhead swing, rotate the chisel 30 degrees, and strike again. Strike. Rotate. Strike. Each impact chipped away a fraction of an inch of gray rock, sending a shower of grit raining down onto her upturned face. By the third day, the blisters on her hands had bubbled up, broken, and bled, gluing her skin to the wooden hammer handle. She wrapped her hands in strips of fabric torn from her old petticoats, biting her lip to keep from crying out when she gripped the tool. She couldn't let Leo hear her pain. Leo was the silent witness to her war with the mountain. He sat near the cave entrance, playing with the rock chips she swept away, his small face often streaked with the same gray dust that coated Clara's hair and filled her lungs. The dust was insidious. It grit between her teeth and irritated her eyes until they were constantly red and swollen. "Are we winning, Mama?" Leo asked one evening in July, watching her slump against the wall, her arms trembling so violently she could barely lift a spoon to feed him. Clara looked at the hole, a dark 10-inch throat she was carving upward. They were averaging 3 inches a day. 3 inches of progress for 10 hours of agony. "We're winning, baby," she lied, her voice raspy from the limestone particles. August brought a new kind of torture. As the tunnel deepened past 10 feet, gravity became an enemy. Debris didn't just fall, it had to be coaxed. Clara fashioned a long stick to jam up the hole, dislodging the broken rock that threatened to choke the shaft. Every time she cleared it, jagged rocks rained down, threatening to bruise her arms and face. The physical toll was reshaping her. The soft curves of her previous life melted away, consumed by the calorie deficit of hard labor on a 50-cent diet. Her waist thinned to a frightening degree, but her shoulders and arms grew hard and ropey, sculpted by the millions of hammer swings. She was becoming something else, harder, sharper, like the chisel she wielded. By September, they had reached 16 feet. Clara was running on fumes. Her neck was locked in a permanent, painful stiffness from months of looking up. The doubt whispered louder than the hammer strikes. What if Henderson was right? What if she hits granite? What if she dies in here and leaves Leo alone? But she looked at Leo sleeping in the corner, coughing in the stagnant air. She picked up the hammer. It happened on a Tuesday in late September. Clara was deep in the rhythm, strike, rotate, strike, when the resistance suddenly vanished. The chisel didn't bounce back. It punched through. She gasped, nearly dropping the heavy hammer. A beam of pure, unfiltered sunlight shot down the shaft, piercing the gloom of the cave. It hit the floor like a spotlight. Dust motes danced in the sudden draft. Fresh, sweet air rushed in, smelling of sagebrush and freedom. Clara dropped to her knees, not in prayer, but in exhaustion, laughing and crying all at once as the breeze touched her face. She had done it. She had drilled through 20 feet of mountain with her own 2 bleeding hands. "Leo," she whispered, shaking him awake, her dust-caked face breaking into a radiant smile. "Look, I brought you the sun." November passed with a deceptively mild chill, allowing Clara to finish the interior work. She built a stone firebox at the base of her new chimney, arranging rocks to channel the smoke directly into the updraft. When she lit the first test fire, the smoke didn't swirl or choke them. It rose in a perfect straight line, drawn up by the powerful vacuum of the 20-foot shaft. But the real test arrived on December 15th. It wasn't just a storm. It was an execution. An Arctic air mass settled over New Mexico, dropping the temperature from a manageable 20 degrees to a bone-crushing 15 below zero in 48 hours. The wind howled like a banshee, seeking every crack and crevice in the town's wooden structures. In Silver Ridge, the veneer of civilization began to crack. The superior wooden houses that Mr. Henderson had built and boasted about were failing catastrophically. They were thin-walled boxes fighting a losing battle against thermodynamics. Heat bled out through the roofs and windows faster than stoves could produce it. By the 3rd day of the freeze, the town was in crisis. Mr. Henderson, the man who had mocked Clara's cave, was now feeding his own handcrafted dining chairs into his stove, burning the very furniture he'd built just to keep his parlor above 45 degrees. Sarah, Clara's neighbor, was in even worse shape. Her woodpile was gone. She was burning books, novels, school primers, even the family Bible, tearing out pages to buy a few minutes of heat. Her youngest daughter's lips were turning a terrifying shade of blue, the early sign of hypothermia setting in inside her own living room. A mile away, inside the hole in the ground, physics was proving Clara right. The cave didn't have to fight the cold from the outside. It was protected by millions of tons of limestone. The Earth maintained a constant baseline temperature of 52 degrees, regardless of the blizzard raging outside. While the townspeople tried to raise their homes from 15 below zero to a livable temperature, a massive 80-degree climb, Clara only had to lift her home from 52 to 65. She burned just 4 logs that evening. The limestone walls absorbed the heat from the fire and radiated it back slowly, creating a gentle, enveloping warmth that lasted for hours. Leo sat on the rug, playing with wooden blocks, his cheeks rosy and warm. He wasn't coughing. He wasn't shivering. He was safe. Then came the knock. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but desperate. Clara unlatched the heavy wooden door. Sarah stood there, shivering violently, clutching her bundled daughter to her chest. Her eyes were wide with fear, expecting to find Clara and Leo frozen to death in their primitive dwelling. "Clara?" Sarah stammered, her teeth chattering. We have no heat. My baby is freezing. I didn't know where else to go." Clara opened the door wider. "Get inside, Sarah, quickly." Sarah stumbled over the threshold and stopped dead. The warmth hit her instantly. It wasn't the dry, smoky, scorching heat of a desperate stove. It was a solid, ambient warmth that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was 68 degrees inside. Sarah looked at Leo playing comfortably in his shirt sleeves. Then she looked at the small, efficient fire crackling in the stone hearth, the smoke vanishing perfectly up the chimney. She looked at Clara, not the crazy widow she had pitied, but a woman who had engineered a miracle. It's warm, Sarah whispered, tears freezing on her lashes as they melted in the heat. How? We're burning everything we own and we're freezing. You're burning nothing. Clara gently guided Sarah toward the fire. It's not magic, Sarah. It's the rock. The house you live in fights the earth. My home works with it. As Sarah sank to the floor, wrapping her warming hands around her child, the power dynamic in Silver Ridge shifted forever. The storm raged on outside, but the safest place in the territory wasn't the bank or the mayor's mansion. It was the widow's cave. The blizzard raged for 8 days, but the social hierarchy of Silver Ridge collapsed in 4. Word traveled through the frozen town faster than the wind. The widow in the hole wasn't freezing. She was comfortable. By the morning of the 5th day, it wasn't just Sarah huddled by the limestone hearth. The cave had become a sanctuary. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid Clara now stood in her living room, wrapped in blankets, soaking in the radiant heat that the stone walls released slowly, like a held breath. Then came the knock that mattered most. When Clara opened the heavy door, Mr. Henderson stood there. The man who had built half the town looked small, defeated, and shivering uncontrollably. His eyebrows were frosted with ice, and his pride had been stripped away by the relentless sub-zero temperature. "Mrs. Miller," he chattered, his voice barely a whisper. "My house. The pipes burst. The wood stove can't keep up. May I come in?" Clara stepped aside. She didn't gloat. She didn't remind him of his mockery or his threats to take Leo away. She simply pointed to the fire. Henderson walked to the center of the room and stopped. He looked up at the chimney shaft, the impossible hole drilled through 20 feet of rock. He felt the draft pulling the smoke up perfectly. He touched the warm limestone wall. He was a builder, and he knew instantly that he was looking at a superior design. "I told you this was foolish," Henderson said quietly, staring into the fire. "I told you that you were digging a grave." He turned to look at Leo, who was sitting on the rug, building a tower out of kindling wood, safe and healthy. "I was wrong. This isn't a cave, Clara. It's the finest engineering in the territory." The thaw came a week later, but life in Silver Ridge never went back to the way it was. The crazy widow was gone. In her place stood the town's new expert on thermal heating. That spring, Clara didn't have to take in laundry. Henderson himself hired her as a consultant to help redesign the ventilation for the new schoolhouse. Families paid her $5, a fortune, to inspect their chimneys and suggest improvements based on thermal mass principles. Clara and Leo lived in that cave for 12 years. It wasn't a symbol of poverty anymore. It was a testament to American grit. She saved every dollar she earned, eventually sending Leo to a university in the East to study architecture. He grew up not with the memory of being cold and hungry, but with the memory of a mother who moved a mountain by hand to keep him warm. Years later, a historical marker would be placed near the site. It talks about the Chen Miller ventilation system, but it leaves out the most important part. It wasn't just physics that drilled that hole through the rock. It was a mother's refusal to accept the world's no. Clara Miller proved that sometimes the warmth we need doesn't come from expensive houses or the approval of others. It comes from the fire we light ourselves, in the darkest places, when everyone else says it's impossible. So here's my question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where everyone told you that your idea was crazy or impossible, but you knew deep down it was the only way to save yourself? How did you find the strength to pick up the hammer and keep swinging? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one. And if Clara's story warmed your heart today, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We share stories of resilience, history, and the incredible human spirit every week. Don't miss the next one. Stay warm, everyone.